Hey guys, Mr. Tweet here. So in this screencast, I'm going to be talking to you guys about kind of extreme politicians and gerrymandering and some potential solutions to that issue. One of the common complaints that people have about our government and specifically about Congress is that it's so extreme and that it's becoming more divisive. That's a word that you might hear people talking about, and it just means like divided. So that in Congress, there's not a lot of people that are kind of in the middle or in the center, which is where most Americans identify themselves politically. What you tend to get is you tend to get people who are kind of on the more extreme sides, on the extreme right or on the extreme left, or maybe not right or left as much as kind of like extreme Republicans, extreme Democrats, whereas most people kind of find themselves somewhere in the middle. So why is this? One of the big reasons is because of the gerrymandering problem that you learned about yesterday. That what happens is when politicians get to draw their own lines, they end up making these really skewed districts so that you have some areas that are going to be like really hardcore Republican and others that are going to be kind of made really hardcore Democrat. And when that happens, it creates this situation where the general election doesn't really matter. Now, our election system is broken up into kind of two phases. The primary, where we pick who's going to run from the major parties, and then the general election, where we have the face-off between the people from the two different parties. So what happens when you have one of those like extreme Republican or extreme Democrat districts is that in the primary election, that's the one that really matters. So like if we know that an area is like 70% Republican, you can pretty much guarantee that the Republican is going to win the general election. A great example of this is East County, San Diego in the House of Representatives. That East County, San Diego is like 60 to 70% Republican. And we know that it's going to vote Republican every time. In the last election, you had a Republican candidate who had been indicted for stealing money from his own campaign and doing other, illegal acts, and he still won. And the reason why he won was because this indictment didn't happen until after the primary election. So he won that primary election, and then the indictment happened, and people found out about all this shady stuff that he was doing, stealing money from his own campaign, having an affair, cheating on his wife. Even though he had done, we learned all of these bad things he had done, he still won the general election. And the reason why, again, is because the district was heavily Republican to begin with. So what it means is that the primary election is oftentimes more important than the general election for members of Congress, especially the House of Representatives, when they're in gerrymandered districts. So what do we do about this? How do we stop this from happening? Because in the primary election, the candidates that win are usually the more extreme because it's just the people from that party who are voting for them. So like in the primary election, if we have a district that's gerrymandered to be heavily Democrat, only Democrats are allowed to vote for the Democratic candidate in the primary. And typically the people who show up and vote are the most extreme members of that party. So you get the most extreme Democrats showing up to vote. And who are they going to vote for? Probably the most extreme Democrat. So what you get in gerrymandered districts is you get the primary election ends up being more important, and the primary system picks the most extreme candidates. So we end up with really extreme people in the House of Representatives as a result. It becomes very divisive. So what do we do about it? Well, there's a few ideas. In California, we've been trying a new experiment for about 6 or 8 years now. And what this new experiment is called top two. It's like a top two voting system. So what happens is in the primary election, you can vote for whoever you want. So even if you're a Republican, you can vote for a Democrat. If you're a Democrat, you can vote for a Republican. And importantly, if you're an independent person, an undecided voter, maybe somebody who's in the middle between the two, you get to vote as well. And then in the general election, the top two candidates move on. So what that might mean in a state of like California, which across the whole state, it's like 60% Democratic, it's 40% like Republican, roughly. In California, the top two get to go on to the general election. So for things like senator or governor, where the whole state gets to vote for those people, right? It's been a Democrat. It's going to be a Democrat for a long time because there's so many more Democrats than Republicans. But with the top two voting system, what would happen is the top two vote getters for those positions, they go on to the general election. So what you should get is you should get like maybe two Democrats end up running, going in, they're the two that are going to be running for governor. Or maybe two Democrats end up running for Senate. Or maybe two Republicans end up moving on to the election to represent East County, San Diego, in the House of Representatives. Well, the thinking here is that if two Republicans move on or two Democrats move on, then what's going to happen in the general election is that if you're like a Democrat who lives in East County, San Diego, and you've got to choose between the two Republicans, the thinking is that you're going to choose the one who's not so extreme. You're going to choose the one that's more in the middle. So now, instead of us getting the most extreme Republican, now we maybe will get somebody who's like the more moderate Republican going to Washington, D.C. Somebody who's more in the middle and less of the extreme, at least in theory. For senators from California, we should see more moderate Democrats instead of more extreme Democrats, because we know the general election, it's not really going to matter. Democrats are going to win the general election for senator in California. It's the primary, where in the old system, whoever won the Democratic primary was like, got a free ticket to go to Washington, D.C., probably the more extreme Democrat. But now, top two move forward, and so what that means is maybe we get an extreme and a moderate Democrat, and then in the general election, that 40% of Republicans can throw their weight behind the more moderate Democrat, in theory. So that's how California has decided to deal with this issue of gerrymandering and extreme politicians, is to move to a top two voting system. Other ideas include having somebody besides politicians draw the boundaries for districts. So like in California, it was proposed, maybe it was like 20 years ago or so, it was proposed that we create like a panel of judges to draw the lines, because judges should be more impartial. In recent years, you've seen proposals for us to have computer programs that no person is in charge of, that draws the lines for these districts. And they actually do have these computer programs, and then you can put in them different assumptions that you want. So like you can try to have it like, you know, where you have the districts as small and compact as possible, or there's other possibilities as well. But it's ways to try to make it so that it's more independent and it's not politician drawing their own borders. So that's the California top two primary system. And the idea that, you know, some other ideas, or at least another idea for how we can draw those lines, having a panel of judges do it, maybe having a computer program do it as well. But again, the whole purpose here is to try to remove some of the divisiveness from our politics and try to make it so that we have more kind of people in Washington, D.C. that represent your average American, somebody who's not an extreme Democrat or extreme Republican, and a little bit closer to the center. So anyways, that's that. I'll be back in a moment and with your directions for today's assignment. Peace.